All right, so we are looking at the social cognitive perspective, still talking about personality. And this is the last video for that. Make sure you're taking notes and that you have questions and those kind of things to come to class with. But the social cognitive perspective views behavior as influenced by the interaction between persons and their social context. And this is something that we've talked about again and again and again in psychology. It's the idea of the social aspects versus individual aspects, and that's a huge part of development and a huge part of personality development. Reciprocal determinism is the interacting influences between personality and then also environmental factors. So I think it's easier to look at kind of in this chart. The idea of environmental factors, right, is that you choose to be in this environment. I think especially here at Spring Hill, the idea that you chose to be here. You put yourself in that environment. So things like what you choose to be, who you choose to be friends with, what groups you choose to join, all of those are environmental factors that influence your personality. And then you have internal personal cognitive factors. There are some of us who you are just more anxious than other people, and you see the world as maybe a scarier place, or you see there are people who see danger at every corner, and that's a personality thing. That's an internal factor that influences the way that we look at the world. It's again that view of optimism. And then we also have the idea of behavior of, how do we act? So, in the idea of bungee jumping, what the picture gives you is that, environmental friends, you may have bungee jumping loving friends. And then you also like high risk activities. So then in your behavior, it comes through that you learn how to bungee jump. In the social cognitive perspective, we also have this sense of personal control, that our sense of controlling our environment rather than feeling helpless, that we are kind of the masters of our own fate, our own destiny. The external locus of control, the perception that chance or outside forces beyond one's personal control determine one's fate. So an external locus of control, it's the idea that there are factors that we can't control, that are beyond us, and so we can't even begin to try to do that they are just outside our control, like that we don't have any kind of control over them. Then you have the internal locus of control. You have people that believe that we do control our own destiny, the perception that one controls one's own fate, that your destiny, your fate is in the hands of yourself, so that you are controlling, you're driving the bus, so to speak. A lot of times people who have more of that external locus of control start to develop this idea of learned helplessness, which is the helplessness and passive resignation an animal or a human learns when you're unable to avoid repeated aversive events. So for example, in learned helplessness, you a lot of times have these uncontrollable bad events that we feel like continuously happen to us. Why does everything happen to us? Why is there all of this drama? Why? So then we get this feeling of this perceived lack of control, that we don't have any influence on our environment. And so then we begin to look at generalized helpless behavior. So it becomes this cycle of like, bad things always happen to me. I can't do anything about it, so I'm just not going to do it. I fail every test. Even if I study, it's still going to happen to me. I'm still going to fail the test. I'm just not going to study. And you've heard that excuse. You may use that excuse, and it just goes around and around and around. And it's learned helplessness. And it's very hard to kind of break out of that cycle, but it's a personality thing. The idea that, yes, are there things beyond your control? Absolutely. But there are things that are definitely within your control. Psychologists would tell you in the social cognitive perspective, those psychologists are looking at those things, really focusing on what can you control. Like, maybe I can't control this, but I can control my own behavior. You can control your reaction to the situation. And that's what these psychologists are really focusing on when it comes to the idea of learned helplessness. Another big, this is kind of a new thing, is positive psychology, the scientific study of optimal human functioning. It aims to discover and promote conditions that enable individuals and communities to thrive. So it's really looking at all of these things, that the idea that we want to be positive. And so how can acting positively influence the people around you, your environment, all of your conditions. And we've talked a little bit about this, and we'll talk more about it in social psych, because the idea is if you're positive and you put out positive vibes, that you can influence the people around you to be positive. So if you smile at somebody, eventually they're going to smile back at you, and maybe you're not feeling the positivity, but eventually if you keep smiling, you will feel positive, and that'll brush off onto other people. So keep smiling. And then in the social cognitive perspective, we're really looking at ourselves. If we're talking about personality, I mean, that's a very individual thing. Psychology is the study of the individual. Sociology is that study of groups. So when we look at ourselves, one of the things that people are really bad about, and especially teenagers, is this idea of the spotlight effect. Overestimating others, noticing and evaluating our performance, our appearance, our blunders. So to test this out, there was a psychologist that made his students wear Barry Manilow t-shirts, which they were not cool at all. This is in your book. You can see a picture of the Barry Manilow t-shirt. And so he had them estimate how many people would take notice of the Barry Manilow t-shirt, and the kids were like, over half of our classmates are going to notice that we are wearing these t-shirts. In reality, it was like 23% noticed that they were wearing these t-shirts. It's like if you've ever had a bad hair day or a zit or something, and you feel like everybody's staring at you, and in truth, people don't really notice. So we're kind of narcissistic in that way, but that idea of that we overestimate people noticing us. And teenagers really do that, because teenagers, remember, are in that egocentric type of stage. Our self-esteem is just the idea of one's feelings of high or low self-worth, how we feel about ourselves. And people with lower self-esteem actually tend to overestimate the spotlight effect. So if you have low self-esteem, you really feel like people are always kind of judging and looking at you, even if that's not true. And then we have this concept of self-serving bias, the readiness to perceive oneself favorably. So a lot of times we see ourselves much better than other people see us. So for example, if I asked you to, let's predict how you're going to do on a test. You're going to be in the top 10% or the bottom 10%, the middle 10%. Most of you are going to say that you're going to be in the top 10%. That we overestimate how ready we are, or how favorably we perceive ourselves, which is kind of interesting, because a lot of times we openly kind of maybe put ourselves down, but in reality we actually use a self-serving bias to kind of push ourselves forward. And then you have individualism versus collectivism. In North America, especially in the United States, we are very much of an individualistic society. We usually give our priorities, our goals. It's a very much me, I type of society. That goals and defining one's identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identifications. We usually, we can come up with our personal attributes in the way that we feel about ourselves. We don't necessarily tend to look at groups and associate with groups. We're much more individualistic. Collectivism is when you give priority to the goals of one's group. So in societies like Korea, your book points out, are very deferential to the elders in the group. One's extended family or work group, you define your identity according to them. And your book talks about the fact that one of the ways they best see this is that over the course of time, baby names, there used to be a top 10, and over time we continuously move away from those top 10. I mean, you think about how many Amy's and Jennifer's and Jan's and Marcy's do you know? We have names like Zainab or Carissa, or kind of outside the box. My name is Bree. That's not necessarily something that you're going to hear every day. That we are becoming more individualistic even in naming our children. So you look at celebrities that name their kids River, or I don't know, they have all kind of different names. That's part of our individualistic culture, our individualistic society. It's not necessarily this idea of collectivism and the group association. So you can see in the chart the idea of the differences between individualism and collectivism. So the idea of what matters is me, like personal achievement, fulfillment, rights, and liberties. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think, a lot of times maybe you'll look at individualism and you'll see it as something being selfish. But I think it's our society. It's the way that our society kind of works. If you want to get ahead, a lot of times you do have to think about yourself. And I'm not saying you push the group down or to the wayside, but at the end of the day, we think about our individual success. Like, your success is personally important to you. What you are going to do in college or in the future or whatever is more important maybe than what you and the people that you sit with at lunch are going to do. And then the very last thing I just want to talk about is terror management theory. The faith in one's worldwide view and the pursuit of self-esteem provide protection against a deeply rooted fear of death. So this is kind of a negative, pessimistic view of our personality, but the idea is that we have this deep sense of fear of death, and so that our personality is motivated by things that move us away from that fear of death. And so it's a terror management kind of theory that we're working off of, that we're scared. So we're scared to stop moving. We're scared to stop pushing forward. I mean, I think about you guys are, and teachers as well, and not just teachers, but everybody is very, not high maintenance, but everybody's very busy, and it's hard to take a breath or slow down sometimes. And so we're constantly driven by like this fear of failure, that we're not going to succeed. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be death, but it can also be this sense of failure, that we're not going to be the best person that we can be individualized. So that's that idea that's how our personality develops, that we actually develop our personality out of that we are afraid to not keep moving forward, to slow down, that we are afraid of that. So that's kind of the discussion about how personality develops. Make sure that if you have any questions that you let me know. We'll cover a few more things in class as well to kind of add to this discussion. See you guys later.